Please welcome Kalena Gravina.
All right. Welcome to our capstone presentation. My name is Kalena Gravina, and I will be presenting on behalf of my team. And our project was to look at whether New York state agencies could use a green revolving fund to accelerate their fleet's adoptions of electric vehicles. And over this presentation, I will start with an overview of the project and also of a green revolving fund, and then focus primarily on our key findings, which we put in two buckets, fund mechanics and financial feasibility, and then go over our further considerations and then leave you with a recommendation. So the transportation sector is one of the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. It's pretty widely known. And New York state agencies are working to reduce their emissions in this sector by greening their fleets with electric vehicles. And some New York state agencies are participating in a mandate that commits them to making their 25% of their new vehicle purchases alternative fuel vehicles by 2025. And we're going to use the term alternative fuel vehicles throughout this presentation to describe different types of electric vehicles. So those could be hybrids, plug-in hybrids, or electric vehicles. The issue with alternative fuel vehicles in this mandate is that they have higher capital costs, and New York agencies are working with tight budgets. So the other important thing about alternative fuel vehicles is that they have a lot of operational savings and maintenance savings. And the DEC, who is our client, is leading the strategy for these agencies to reduce their emissions. And they have asked us to look at a green revolving fund because it's a way of capturing those operational savings, which can then accelerate purchases of more vehicles. So we're going to go over what a green revolving fund is. It's typically managed centrally by a budgeting agency, and it requires an initial amount of funding, which is also called seed funding, to begin the procurement process. And the DEC has already initiated this step. They've looked into, they haven't secured it. They have identified $1 million of potential seed funding. And the second part of this process is that fund would then be lended to the agencies who would use the money to cover the incremental costs between alternative fuel vehicles and conventional vehicles, which can range anywhere from about $2,000 to $13,000. And this is done through an application process, and then the loan terms are finalized in a memorandum of understanding. The third part of this process is that the agencies start driving these cars. And when they do, the more and more they drive them, the more and more savings they're realizing from fuel and maintenance. And that leads us to the fourth part of this, which is that these agencies can use some of these savings to repay their loans while also retaining some of the savings for their operational benefits. And what we have is a self-sustaining fund that allows for procurement of electric vehicles, and then they can also retain some of their savings. And green revolving funds are an established practice, especially in energy efficiency projects, but they're not widely used in electric vehicle purchasing. And so our client, the DEC, has asked us to really focus on the feasibility and issues surrounding green revolving funds and public fleet purchases, and to avoid some of the uncertainty around charging infrastructure and other things like that with such a nascent industry. So now we're going to talk about our key findings, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the fund mechanics. We did a survey of 23 green revolving funds focused both in electric vehicles and also in efficiency projects. And we outlined our key findings in more in-depth case studies of the most relevant funds that we had discovered. And these are our key findings that we came with from our research. Looking at the Harvard Green Loan Fund and also at the Texas Lone Star Revolving Fund, it became really apparent to us how important tracking and reporting is for various reasons, but most importantly that it demonstrates the success of the fund. And in this case, it allowed for additional capital deposits to be put back into the fund. Another important piece of information that we got from these case studies were by looking at specifically the Oregon Fund, which was for electric vehicles, and hadn't been able to distribute any funding yet. And that was mostly because there wasn't a strong agency outreach plan, and these incentives and loan terms were just not clearly communicated. And then the last point that we want to make in this portion of our research is that most of the funds that we looked at, a majority of them, used interest rates. And interest rates provide a lot of benefits, including more money being put back into the fund and also protecting the fund from inflation. So now we're going to look at how this would look for New York State agencies using a green revolving fund. And we made a financial model. We used information from the DEC, we used research, and then we also used a set of assumptions, which we just want to call out here. We extracted $100,000 from the seed fund to use for administration needs, and that left us with an actual investment amount of $900,000. We also used an annual mileage estimate of 24,000 miles per vehicle based on the DEC's information, and a payback period of 8 years, which is the life of the car. We also computed this model over 4 different vehicle types, and we used the Nissan Leaf as the EV, the Chevy Volt as the plug-in, the Ford Fusion as the hybrid, and the Chevy Impala as our non-EV traditional car. So with these 4 different types of vehicles, we modeled them in 3 major buckets, and looking at the graph on the left, the first 2 graphs on the left, you can see that all electric vehicles, which is the purple line, has the most significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and annual operating costs. However, looking at the capital cost graph on the far right, you'll see that they're still significantly more expensive than the other types of vehicles. And so our next part of this process was seeing how these different vehicle types play out over time using a $1 million seed fund with a green revolving fund structure. And looking at the amount of vehicles that we would be able to purchase with our green revolving fund model, you can see that in fact there is an increase in the amount of vehicles that we could purchase with a green revolving fund. And also that we could purchase a lot more hybrids than the other types of electric vehicles. And that's mainly because of that very low capital cost that hybrids have. Then we introduced a third scenario to our model, which was to add an interest. And what we found there was that we could increase the amount of hybrid vehicles by almost 200 using an interest rate. It wasn't as feasible for the other 2 because they are much more expensive and the repayments would be harder for the agencies to handle. However, we then added how this 1,700 number, which is the amount of vehicles that would need to be purchased in order to reach the 25% by 2025 goal. And you can see that even with interest, we're not getting close to that mandate goal. So this is an issue with seed funding. We don't have enough seed funding to reach that goal. So our main findings for the financial feasibility portion of our research is that, yes, a green revolving fund could result in more purchases than a one-time fund, which that would be a fund that you would use to pay for the difference in costs instead of having 8 years of purchasing with a revolving fund. And that more vehicles could be purchased with a revolving fund, especially with hybrid vehicles, and that the actual aggregate GHG reductions, because we've purchased so many hybrids, are a lot higher than the other types of vehicles, even though they provide a much more significant reduction in GHG by vehicle. And then also we could allow an interest rate on hybrid vehicles, which would mean that we could make this fund revolve faster. And then our second key finding was that we would need to seek additional funding in order to reach that 25% goal by 2025, and that could either be through seed funding or future capital deposits. So now we're going to look at some of the external impacts, and the first one is fuel cost. We did a sensitivity analysis of a 20-year high and a 20-year low and found that the all-electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles all electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles would in fact be affected if the fuel cost was to go below $2. However, hybrids are not at risk, and the savings would be retained at most fuel prices. And also, we believe that making an investment in technology provides for more long-term stability than the volatile commodities market. And then the second external factor that we looked at was the changing vehicle cost. And the fact that battery costs are falling so rapidly, and batteries make about a third of the cost of an electric vehicle, has a lot of analysts are looking at this, like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who projected that that electric vehicles would reach parity with conventional vehicles in less than 10 years without a subsidy. And that's significant because public fleets couldn't access those tax incentives. So we think this is a good time to implement a fund like this. And our major recommendations, our final recommendations, are that the DEC should pursue a green revolving fund and focus on hybrids and use an interest rate. That also additional funding should be considered to achieve the state's goal. And that the DEC can use our best practices that we outlined in our case studies, but also to focus on these three here: tracking and reporting, agency outreach strategy, and having clear loan terms and incentives. Thank you very much.
Kalena, do you think that there's an opportunity for private investors to participate in a revolving loan fund that serves state agencies?
So we broached the subject with our client, and our client was not wanted to explore not having any private involvement in this. However, we do believe that it may be an option in the future. There's a lot of private-public partnership opportunities in general with the car manufacturers, and that's something that there's a discussion around, but the DEC really just wanted to focus on not having a private involved.